That night brought no sign of misfortune. It arrived gently, like any other night, silently descending upon the familiar little road, where people believed nothing bad would happen after sunset. The air was cool enough for adults to leave their doors slightly ajar, and children lingered outside for a few more minutes before heading home. In small towns like this, darkness isn't something to fear. It's just the remnants of a peaceful day. The fields lie still. The trees stand silent. The gravel road runs straight, without bends or mysteries. Everyone thinks they know every inch of ground beneath their feet. There were children walking along that path feeling completely safe. They laughed and chatted, sharing small, innocent stories. Stories that only made sense to those who had never doubted the world. They believed that just a little further and they would be home. Their parents believed the same, because they had lived here their whole lives. They believed in familiarity, in community, and that evil was always somewhere far away. Not on this road. Not on this night. But some tragedies come without warning. They don't knock. They make no sound. They enter people's lives at a time when everyone believes they are safe. And when that belief shatters, everything that follows will never be normal again. There was no warning sound. No signs of danger emerged in the darkness. Everything changed in a very brief moment, so brief that the human brain didn't have time to comprehend what was happening. From the darkness, a figure emerged. Not hurried. Not rushed. As if he had been there for a long time, waiting for this very moment. The faint flashlight beam flickered in the child's hand, sweeping across the veiled face, then stopping. For that moment, no one spoke. The voice that followed was deep, slow, devoid of anger. It was precisely this calmness that was frightening. He said he had a gun. He said it as a self-evident truth, needing no proof. He said it as if he were certain the children in front of him would believe him. For a moment, no one moved. Their childlike minds searched for another explanation. Perhaps it was just a joke. Perhaps the adults were trying to scare them. Their world had never had room for anything like this. But when the command was repeated, clearer, closer, its meaning struck directly at the fear. The bicycle was pushed to the curb. Knees hit the ground. Pebbles dug into the flesh. The smell of damp earth rose very close, very real. He asked their age. That seemingly harmless question was a turning point. After the first answer, a decision was made. One child was ordered to stand up and run. Run straight into the woods. No looking back. If they turned around, they would be shot. Footsteps echoed in the night. Breathing was ragged. Branches brushed against her face. Darkness swallowed the small figure fleeing. Behind her, the road fell silent again. For the children lying there, time seemed to freeze. They hadn't yet understood why a friend had vanished from their sight, why the world that had been so familiar had suddenly become so strange. In that moment, childhood was cut short. And it would never be restored as before. The fleeing children didn't stop immediately. They ran until their lungs felt like they were about to burst, until their legs wouldn't obey them anymore, until the darkness behind them could no longer catch up. When they finally dared to turn around, the road was empty. The flashlight had disappeared. The friend who had just been there was gone. In that moment, before fear could fully form, confusion overwhelmed them. They didn't know whether they should be happy to be alive or panic for having run away. A series of questions no child should ever have to deal with, flooded their minds. What if I had stayed? What if I had run slower? What if I had turned back? When they got home, their words were broken. Their stories were incomplete. Tears outnumbered their words. The adults listened but didn't fully understand, only sensing one thing very clearly: something had been taken away in the night. Not just one child. In the years that followed, they grew up, but not like other children. Sleep was no longer restful. Sudden sounds made their hearts jump. Darkness was no longer harmless darkness. Every deserted road held a memory. There are nights when that image comes back vividly. The low, deep voice. The cold command. The moment of having to stand up and run, leaving your friend behind. Survival becoming a burden. A question no one can answer. Why am I still alive? People often think of survivors as lucky, but very few ask what they carry with them for the rest of their lives. There are wounds that don't bleed. There are memories that never heal. And there are people who are still breathing, but forever trapped in that moment of the night. When the door was opened, and the story spilled onto the floor in disjointed pieces, the adults tried to piece it back together in the safest way possible. They wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding. That fear had exaggerated everything. that children sometimes imagine things that aren't real. The call was made. Questions preceded action. Details were repeated over and over. Were they sure? Did they see anything clearly? Did they mishear? Meanwhile, the clock continued to tick. Each passing minute stretched further between the truth and the possibility of salvation. No one intentionally did anything wrong. No one wanted to delay. But suspicion crept in quickly, because what had just been said was so unfamiliar to this place. This was a small town, a familiar street. Things like that didn't happen here. At least, that's what people believed. The children were asked to recount the story again. And then again. Each time the memory faded a little, not because of lies, but because of fear. And it was these small changes that led the adults to believe the story wasn't solid enough to warrant immediate action. While everyone was still deliberating, the darkness continued to envelop them. No one ran back down that road. No one cordoned off the area. No one traced the direction the man had come from. Urgency was replaced by procedure. The first mistake isn't a big decision. It's not noisy. It's not malicious. It's just a moment of hesitation when one chooses familiar reassurance over unproven fear. And when the truth is finally acknowledged, the door has closed. From that moment on, the search was no longer ahead of its time. It began to lag behind. And that was a gap no investigation could ever fully bridge. When morning came, the road looked incredibly harmless. Sunlight streamed down the pebbles, a gentle breeze rustled the trees, everything was exactly as it had been yesterday. Only one thing was gone: a child. And that void began to widen hour by hour. Days passed in frantic searches. Then days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Each time there was no result, hope took on a different form. Initially, people believed everything would soon be resolved. That all it took was one more clue, one more call, one more breakthrough. But time brought no answers. It only brought exhaustion. In the child's family home, the clock seemed to stop. The room remained unchanged. The coat was still hanging in its usual place. The familiar sounds of life gradually faded away, replaced by whispers, unfamiliar footsteps, and the ringing and silence of a telephone. Every night before going to sleep, one wondered if tomorrow would be any different from today. The whole town changed. People started locking their doors earlier. Children were no longer allowed to go out alone. Conversations lowered in tone when strangers entered. The trust that once bound the community together eroded slowly, but very noticeably. Time, in matters like this, is not neutral. It doesn't just pass. It erases the traces. It blurs the memory. It erodes the sense of urgency. Each day that passes without an answer is another day the perpetrator is shielded by silence. No one calls time an accomplice. But as the years drag on, as attention wanes, as pain becomes a habit, time begins to side with one. And that side is not the side of those who are waiting. Some truths aren't buried immediately. They're simply forgotten long enough that no one knows where to find them anymore. And while people learn to live on, time quietly does its most dangerous thing. It makes loss familiar. Years passed, and the incident gradually faded into the town's past. The files grew thicker, but hope dwindled. People began to call it a cold case. A story that no longer had a place on the evening news. It remained only in the memories of those who had lived through that night. And then, somewhere else, in another life, there was someone who could never be forgotten. A child from the past who had grown up. The body had matured, but the memories refused to age. The seemingly insignificant details remained. The low, deep voice. The emotionless command. The familiar warning, don't look back. For years, that person told themselves it was over. That they were just a lucky survivor. That no one needed to hear those painful things again. But as they grew older, the fragments of memory connected. They were no longer disjointed nightmares. They began to resemble a pattern. Then one day, while reading about another case, that person's heart suddenly tightened. There was something eerily familiar about it. Not exactly the same, but enough to evoke a familiar feeling. The killer's composure. The way they chose their victims. The way they disappeared. The decision to speak out didn't come in a heroic moment. It came slowly, after many sleepless nights. Because speaking out meant reopening everything. It meant risking not being believed. It meant once again facing the most painful question: what if I remembered wrong? But the eyewitness understood one thing: if the truth had waited too long, Further silence would only cause it to sink deeper. When he spoke, it wasn't to seek attention, but to put back a piece that time had forgotten. There are cases that only start to move again when someone dares to say, "I was there. I still remember. And I'm still alive to tell the story." In quiet rooms, where there are no tears and no memories, science begins its work. No emotions, no speculation. Only numbers, specimens preserved for a very long time, waiting for the day they can speak for humanity. The evidence seemed outdated. The archive samples lay dormant in the shadows of the records. They didn't call for attention, they just waited. And time, this time, was on the side of truth. As technology advances, what was once impossible is now becoming apparent. A tiny chain, invisible to the naked eye, is beginning to connect the past with the present. One step at a time, very slowly, but without turning back. Those working in the lab understand that every result they achieve is linked to a life. To a family that has waited too long. To questions that have never been answered. They didn't witness that night. But they know that what they are doing could close a gap that has remained open for years. When the results appeared, there was no cheering. Only a heavy silence. Because the truth, however necessary, carries the weight of loss. It doesn't turn back time. It doesn't heal all wounds. But it calls by name something that had once been hidden. Science doesn't deliver complete justice. But it does one important thing. It says that the memories of the survivors are real. That what happened wasn't a figment of imagination. And that, however late, the truth can still find its voice. When the last piece was finally placed in its position, the room fell silent. There was no applause, no moment of triumph. Only a stark truth stood between the people who had waited so long. Names were called out. The story resumed. What had once been a shadow now took on clear form. But at the same time, something else emerged. The person responsible for it all was no longer here. No arrest warrant, no courtroom. No trial date to face the eyes of the families left behind. For many, it was a second blow. They had lived for decades, wondering why. And when they finally got the answer, they didn't have the chance to express their pain to the person who caused it. Justice came, but it came in silence. Some people feel relieved. At least they no longer have to wonder if their memories are wrong. At least the truth has been called by its proper name. But there are also those who feel empty. Because they understand that not every wound can be healed by the truth alone. No trial means no apology. No verdict means no clear resolution. Everything stops at a halfway point, where reason says the case is settled, but the heart hasn't quite caught up. In cases like this, justice doesn't ascend to the podium. It sits quietly in the back row. Not noisy, not satisfying. Just enough to say that what happened was real, and that those years of waiting weren't in vain. When the case is closed on paper, life doesn't go back to how it was before. There's no clear line between then and now. Only subtle changes, creeping into every corner of the town, just as the pain once did. Parents begin to hold their children's hands tighter when crossing the street. Evenings become shorter. Empty roads are no longer harmless shortcuts. Innocence doesn't disappear immediately, but children learn to be cautious. And that's a price no family wants their children to pay. In schools, there's more talk about safety. Not with fear, but with vigilance. Stories once considered far-fetched are now becoming practical lessons. The name of the missing child isn't mentioned as a memory to be exploited, but as a reminder to protect. Some changes aren't codified into law. They live on in new habits. In asking more questions. In observing longer. In deciding not to ignore small signs. The town learns to listen to the faintest voices, because they know the price of not listening. For the survivors, their legacy lies not in fame or praise. It lies in the fact that they dared to tell their story. They dared to stand up after years of silence to say that it happened. And that speaking out changed the way others see the world. The legacy of tragedies like this is never complete. It carries loss, regret, and unanswered questions. But if one thing remains, it is a wake-up call. That safety is not a given. And that protecting each other begins with not turning away when something unusual happens. Years later, the road remains. No signs, no warning markers. The streetlights still turn on every evening, illuminating the familiar gravel surface, as if nothing had ever happened. People still pass by, still drive past, still believe it's just an ordinary stretch of road. But for those who lived through that night, this road is never a harmless place again. It carries the memory of a very brief moment, when everything was cut off. When trust crumbled in silence. When a child disappeared and the whole town changed with it. There is no satisfying ending to stories like this. No explanation is enough to lessen the loss. Only the truth remains. A reminder that the worst things sometimes don't come from the extraordinary, but from the most ordinary nights. Perhaps the most important thing isn't remembering the name of the person who caused the incident. It's remembering that safety isn't something to be taken for granted. It's built on attention, listening, and small actions taken at the right time. That night has long passed, but the question it left behind remains. When darkness falls, when everything seems familiar and peaceful, do we truly look closely around us? The story ends here, but the warning doesn't. It remains, quietly, along that path, in every decision we make, and in how we protect those weaker than ourselves before things become abnormal.